a God in three persons. Okay. Now the second question. Do other religions teach goodness? You know, most of my students are like most Americans, and they believe two very wrong things about the world religions and moralities. They say, they believe, when they walk into my classes, all the world religions teach the same thing. And, you know, most Americans, if you corner them, will say something like that. Except maybe Islam. You know, they might not say that about Islam since 9/11. And most of my students, like most Americans, will also say that the moral systems of the world are radically different. The great moral traditions are totally contradictory. Well, they're wrong on both scores. The world religions are actually radically different when they talk about the vertical. That is, if there's a God, what that God is like, and how to get to that God. You cannot invent more different ways of answering those questions than the great world religions do. But on the horizontal, how to live as a human being with other human beings, all the great moral traditions, which all started with religious visions, by the way, and they're all presently funded by religious vision, they all teach basically the same things. Now, they apply those same things differently, they interpret those same things differently, but they're the same basic principles. They're encapsulated in what we call the Ten Commandments. They all teach that we should be honest, for example. They all teach that sex has to do with marriage. They all teach that the individual should sacrifice himself or herself for the community. There is no moral tradition in the world that says that it's okay to be selfish. There's no moral tradition in the world that says that it's okay to lie, cheat, steal, or to engage in sex as a recreational activity. Now, we Christians shouldn't be surprised, since the Apostle Paul told us in Romans chapter 2 that God has written his law on every human heart. And Paul was talking there about non-Jews and non-Christians, pagans. C.S. Lewis once said that if you were trying to learn about the moral traditions of the world, the moral teachings of the world, of all the different cultures, and you went to the British Museum, which, by the way, is a library, and you spent 3 days there reading all that's been left in print from the great moral traditions of the world, you'd get very bored, because you'd find out that they all are talking about the same basic principles. And he shows this at the end of his wonderful book called The Abolition of Man, in a little section called the Tao. It's actually pronounced Tao, but it's spelled with a T, Tao. So, for instance, Confucius taught the negative golden rule. Don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. Now, that's also called the silver rule. The Buddha taught the 5 precepts. No sex sin, which for Buddhists means if you're a monk, no sex at all. If you're not a monk, either single or married, and no sex except within marriage. No lying, no killing, no alcohol, so you can't be a Lutheran and a Buddhist at the same time. But there's a basic agreement there on the no alcohol, which is the point, the rationale there is that when you're intoxicated, you cannot do the right thing, either religiously or morally. And finally, no stealing. Now, the Quran teaches what we call the Ten Commandments. It doesn't call them the Ten Commandments, but since Muhammad was very, very much influenced by Christian businessmen whom he did business with as a caravan trader, you see the Ten Commandments all over the Quran. Now, as I said, the different moral traditions of the world apply these principles differently. They interpret them differently. For instance, marriage. If you're a Muslim man, you can marry up to 4 wives as long as you treat them all equally, which some Muslim friends of mine say, well, that's impossible, so it's an effective ban on polygamy, although there still are a lot of Muslim polygamists. But nevertheless, Muslims say and believe that you can have intimate relations only with your wife or wives. And it's interesting, you know, this commonality of the world of religions on the horizontal are grounds for our, as Christians, cooperating in the public square with non-Christians on moral and social issues. For example, in 1995, at the World Population Conference in Cairo, Egypt, there was a proposal to make abortion on demand a universal right, universal human right. And Muslims got together with Catholics under the leadership of the Vatican to defeat that proposal, which came, by the way, from America, or from the Americans at the conference. Muslims and Christians are working together today to fight human sex trafficking. So that's the answer to my second question. Is there moral goodness possible in the other world religions? Do the other world religions teach moral goodness? My answer is yes. My third question is, what is unique about Christianity? Well, I think I've already mentioned some answers to that question. As I've said, it's primarily on the vertical, not the horizontal. So it's primarily about, A, whether there's a God, who that God is, and how we come into union with that God, that we have radically different answers from the Christian faith. But let me give you 5 more specific ways in which Christianity is unique among the world religions. First, Jesus is the only religious founder who claimed that he was God. Now, if you went to college and took a course in religious studies, you might have been taught by your professor that the Gospels never claim that Jesus is God, with the exception of the 4th Gospel, John, where it's as clear as day. But they say the synoptics never claim it. That if that professor said it, that professor doesn't know Jewish culture very well. Because the story that is common in the Synoptic Gospels is the story of the healing of the paralytic. Remember, he was brought down through the hole in the roof by his friends? And Jesus says to him, "My son, your sins are forgiven." And the scribes started mumbling, "No one can say that except God alone." And Jesus says, "Well, just to prove to you that I have the authority to say it, watch this." And then he heals the man, and the paralytic, gets up and walks home. All Jews in the first century knew that only God can forgive sins of you that you have committed against someone else. I can't forgive those sins. That other person can, but I can't. Only God can. All Jews knew that, and that's why the text in Mark chapter 2 and elsewhere in the Synoptics says the scribes were mumbling under their breath. That was a clear claim to deity.